My name is Susan Koehler, and I'm the author of Dahlia in Bloom. I have been a teacher for 35 years, and I've been a writer for as long as I can remember. I have published some nonfiction books for kids and some teacher resources as well, but this is my first work of fiction, and it has been a delightful journey. I intended Dahlia in Bloom as middle grade fiction for readers ages 7 to 12, but I have had readers of all ages give me some wonderful feedback, and that has made my heart so happy. And so I hope that you have read it or that you will be reading it and enjoy it. The story is set in 1933 in rural North Carolina. At 8 3/4, Dahlia is the youngest member of her family. She has a sister named Ray, who's kind of a mother figure, and she has a sister named Celia, who she fights with all the time, and she has a brother named Charlie, who is determined to find some buried treasure. That's right, buried treasure. When the story begins, the family is living in a one-room cabin in the mountains of North Carolina. This is during the Great Depression, a time when people all over the country were having serious money troubles. But for people in Dahlia's family, who were poor before the Depression began, just surviving has become a serious challenge. They know what it is to be cold, they know what it is to be hungry, and they know what it is to be afraid. Now, in March of 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated for his first term as President of the United States. In fact, it was the last time a presidential inauguration was held in March. Ever since then, it's been moved to January, where it still is now. One of the very famous quotes from President Roosevelt's speech that day was, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Now, as Dahlia listens to that speech on a radio at a general store around the mountain from her home, she's puzzled. Dahlia's fears are very tangible and very serious, and she doesn't see how she can just push them aside. Now, this book is historical fiction, which means the characters and their stories are made up, but the events of the time period are very real and rooted in history. The experience of the characters should reflect what life was like for people during that time period in this place. President Roosevelt's speech and the Great Depression are two of those very real events. Dahlia was born in 1924, and that's the same year my mother was born. The things I learned about the way people lived at that time came from my mother's stories. She talked often of her experiences growing up, and I was trying to write down her experiences for her, just to keep a record of them, when a magical thing happened. This character of Dahlia popped into my head, and I started seeing her story. And so I decided then that I wanted to write fiction, but I wanted to set it among some of the real experiences my mother talked about. Now, this is a picture of my mother's family, and my mom is the baby in the picture. Her parents are on either side of her, two sisters over here and a brother here. You can see at this time she was the youngest in the family, and she said this was taken on the steps of a general store near her home in the mountains. That gives you a little bit of an idea of what the characters in the book might have looked like. Now, my mom was born in a one-room cabin, and that's where she lived until she was about 5 years old. It was a very isolated area in the mountains. But when she was 5, her family moved to another area called Rural Hall. It was more of a community, and they lived and worked on someone else's farm as tenant farmers. This was something common at the time. Her experiences that she remembers living in Rural Hall were some of her fondest memories. And so I tried to capture the warmth of the community that she remembered when I created the fictional community of Lothan Mill in the book. Again, my characters are made up and their stories are made up, but I hope that the feeling and experiences come across as being very realistic for many people at that time. Now another thing I have from this time period is a shoe-fly quilt pattern. It's something mentioned in the book very early on and in other places throughout the book. This is a pink and white shoe-fly quilt block. It's made, as you can see, of triangles and squares, all pieced together. And you would take many of these and put them together to make the quilt top. And then a solid piece of fabric would form the back of the quilt, and the middle would be filled with something called cotton batting. After putting all 3 layers together, a quilter would sew the pieces together either with very elaborate stitches or by putting through individual threads and knotting them to make what's called a tack quilt. I also have this dough bowl here. As you can see, it's made of wood, and this one is an actual replica of the dough bowl owned by my grandmother. Back in these times, of course, everything was made from scratch, and people made a lot of biscuits and breads and pastry crusts. And so this was something like we would use a mixing bowl for today. You would put your ingredients in here and mix them together and knead the dough. If the dough required rising, then you would leave it in this bowl to rise. So dough bowls were very common of the time period, and that's something mentioned in the book as well. Kind of helps you picture it when you see the real objects. I also have a rag doll here. Now, store-bought toys would not be something owned by people like Dahlia and her family. They didn't have money for that kind of thing. They didn't even deal with a lot of money like we do today. This rag doll is made out of fabric and thread, and she has a couple of buttons and some yarn for hair. In the book, Dahlia has a rag doll that becomes very important to her. This is kind of how I pictured her looking. I'm going to close by reading the first chapter of Dahlia in Bloom to you. I hope that you will go ahead and read the rest of it yourself. I also hope that you will talk with your parents or older relatives or grandparents if you're lucky enough to have them. Listen to the stories of their childhoods and write them down. You'll preserve history, and that's the best way to learn history. And also, maybe one day, you'll write a book. Dahlia in Bloom. Can a person just decide to give up feeling scared? For as long as I could remember, I'd had a fear of snakes and thunder and my sister Celia when she's mad. Looking down from someplace way up high always gave me terrible jitters and made my belly jump up in my chest. But the worst kind of scared I knew was when Mommy's forehead got that worried wrinkle and Poppy went hunting for squirrels because meat was hard to come by and we had a lot of mouths to feed. So I understood fear. What I did not understand was what I heard the day we walked from Zeke's cabin around the mountain to Pete Gaddy's store and gathered by the radio. That's when our new president said something that made no sense. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Pete Gaddy shook his head and said, "Up here on the mountain, fear is what's keeping most folks alive." Now, I didn't know about that, but I knew that fear itself was not what scared me. It was snakes and thunder and high up places and going hungry. And Celia, of course. I tried to ask my brother Charlie what he thought about the president's nonsense, but Charlie shushed me right away. He was caught up in a story Pete Gaddy was telling. "You know," Pete said to Poppy, "folks say old Zeke buried a treasure somewhere under that cabin of his." He was talking about our home, of course. Old Zeke was my grandpap's uncle, and he built that cabin for him and his wife, Juliet. They'd been dead and gone more than a dozen years by the time I came along in 1924, but everyone on Harrell Mountain still called our place Zeke's cabin. Poppy looked at the dull wooden floorboards. He put his hands on his hips and shook his head back and forth. "That old story is just a bunch of foolishness," he said. "If old Zeke had had him a treasure, it wouldn't make sense for him to bury it and go on living like poor folk." Charlie wasn't looking at the floor, though. His eyes gazed upward like he could see that treasure spread out on the ceiling. I think he started making a plan right then and there to find Zeke's treasure. And that's how come 2 weeks later, I strolled outside and found him down on his hands and knees using an old axe blade to scrape out a tunnel by the base of the chimney. "Poppy said it's just a bunch of foolishness," I reminded him. I rocked my little corn husk doll in my arms, careful not to squeeze her brittle body too hard. Charlie jabbed that axe blade into the cold, hard earth. "I'm tired of being poor," he said. "If I find that treasure, we won't sleep on straw bed ticks in a one-room cabin. We'll live like Mr. John D. Rockefeller in a big mansion with a bunch of servants, fancy clothes, and all the food you can imagine. I'll even get you a store-bought doll. You mark my words, Dahlia." I hugged my corn husk baby, knowing she wouldn't last much longer. She looked a far cry different from when Grandpap first twisted the dried husks and tied them together with twine. She sure was a comfort when I was sick and had to keep to the bed, but I couldn't help but imagine what a store-bought doll would feel like in my arms. That's when an amazing notion sprang into my head. Mr. John D. Rockefeller probably didn't have anything to fear. He could just hide away in his golden walls with all his trinkets and toys and never worry about being hungry. Best of all, if he didn't want to see some mean old ugly sister, he could just stay on his own side of the mansion and never have to look at her. With enough money, a person could buy away any reason they ever had to feel afraid. "I reckon I'll help you dig," I told Charlie. I leaned my corn husk doll against the chimney and crouched by my brother, scraping dirt with my fingers. The ground was softer and more like soil several inches down. Ants scurried around in a panic and slick brown worms wiggled their way deeper into the ground. "You need to stay back," he said. "You're only 8 years old, and I don't want to be blamed for you getting hurt or getting sick again." 8 3/4, I corrected him, and I spit in the dirt to make sure he knew I was serious. He stopped for a minute and squinted at me. "Fussy in particular," he said. "That's how you got your name." Ooh, he knew how to irritate me. Mommy's favorite flowers were dahlias, so she planted them out in front of Zeke's cabin. They had big, colorful blossoms in the summer, but when cold weather came on, the plants all but disappeared. Mommy would say, "You just have to have faith. Those little dahlias will grow back and bloom again when the winter passes." Maybe they were particular, and she sure did fuss over them, but that's not why she called me Dahlia. I spit again, a little closer to him this time. "Mommy told me I got my name because I was born in July when the beautiful dahlias were bursting into bloom." "Believe what you want," he said, "but I know the truth." And he went back to digging. It was clear that Charlie didn't want my help, so I backed away and brushed the dirt from my hands. The March wind was a mix of warm and chill. I wrapped Mommy's old scarf around my neck in a couple of loops and tucked the ends into the top of my dress. "I'm going for a walk," I said. He didn't even look up. I wasn't actually allowed to go off on my own, so I figured I'd just stroll all the way around the cabin, and maybe by the time I made it back to the chimney, he'd be tired enough to let me help. Zeke's cabin was tucked up in a holler in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The cabin was deeper than it was wide, and there were only a couple of windows on one side. It had a door on the front and a door on the back, kind of like little bookends that held a bunch of stories in between. And the saddest story of all was about old Zeke himself. Zeke and Juliet had a little baby girl, and they named her Polly. Zeke built a cradle out of pine wood for that little baby and carved little rose vines at each end of it. Juliet sewed a pink and white baby quilt with a shoe fly pattern. Grandpap said a whole bunch of love was sewed into that quilt, but even all that love couldn't protect little Polly. A sickness stole through the mountain, and Juliet and little Polly both came down with a terrible fever. The baby faded out of this world in just a few days' time. Zeke dug that baby a grave in the cold ground of the family cemetery. He turned that beautiful cradle into a coffin and buried little Polly in it. Then he got on his knees at Juliet's bedside and promised the Lord all sorts of things if he'd just let her live. Well, she did live, but they never had any more children. They plowed a small field in the clearing out in front of the cabin and just kept to themselves mostly. Juliet hadn't come from this mountain. Her people lived over near Jefferson, and nobody knew much about him. All I know was Zeke married her and brought her back to Harrell Mountain. He built that cabin for her, and who knows, maybe he buried a treasure under it. I eased around the corner to where Charlie was digging and spotted my corn husk doll leaning against the chimney, spattered with loose dirt. I cleared my throat as I moved closer, but Charlie never looked up. He just kept jabbing that axe blade into the earth and dragging out mounds of dirt. I opened my mouth to speak, but never got the words out, because that's when it happened. Clink! Charlie's blade hit something solid, and we both froze.